The moment my husband Richard leaned back in his ergonomic chair with that self-satisfied smirk, I knew what was coming. I had sensed it for months. The hushed conversations that stopped when I entered our office, the locked spreadsheets, the late-night strategy sessions I wasn't invited to. My gut had been screaming that something was wrong ever since Natalie, our indispensable marketing director, started showing up in designer outfits that matched her suddenly highlighted hair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had prepared myself for this moment, and yet, watching it unfold in our boardroom, surrounded by investors who wouldn't meet my eyes, I still felt the knife twist of betrayal. "The board has voted, Claire. We're restructuring leadership," Richard announced, his voice carrying that practiced corporate neutrality that did nothing to mask his triumph. "It's time for Lumina Wellness to move in a new direction." Beside him, Natalie couldn't quite suppress her victorious smile. Her hand rested casually on the table, fingers adorned with a diamond tennis bracelet I recognized immediately, the one Richard had claimed was lost during his business trip to Chicago last month. The conference room felt suddenly airless, the modern glass table between us stretching like an ocean. The company I had built from a single yoga studio into a 15-location wellness empire with digital platforms and product lines was being taken from me by my husband. And apparently, his girlfriend. "The transition package is fair," Richard continued, sliding a leather portfolio toward me. 5 years' salary as severance, retention of your founder shares, though diluted, of course, and a non-compete that's quite standard in these situations. I didn't reach for the folder. Instead, I glanced around the table at our 5-person board: Richard, myself, Natalie, appointed 6 months ago in a move I had foolishly supported, and our 2 main investors, Gregory from Pinnacle Ventures and Mira from Elevation Capital. "A non-compete?" I repeated, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building beneath my ribs. "For the company I created while teaching yoga out of our garage? The one I named after my grandmother?" Richard sighed with theatrical patience. "Claire, this isn't personal. It's about scaling effectively. You're brilliant at wellness concepts, at understanding what clients want, but Lumina needs experienced corporate leadership to reach its potential. And that leadership is you. And Natalie," I stated flatly. "The board believes our combined expertise in corporate growth and digital marketing represents Lumina's best path forward," Natalie interjected, her first contribution to the conversation. Her voice carried the syrupy tone of someone delivering practiced condolences. I noticed how she said Lumina instead of Lumina Wellness, the truncation we'd debated for months that I had consistently rejected. So they'd already decided on the rebranding too. I sat perfectly still, my posture trained by decades of yoga practice to reveal nothing of the earthquake happening inside me. 5 years of marriage, 8 years building this company, all dismantled in what was clearly a carefully orchestrated coup. "And what exactly makes either of you qualified to run a wellness company?" I asked, voice calm. "Richard, you joined 3 years ago from a tech background. Natalie, you've been here 8 months. Neither of you has any experience in wellness program development." Richard's jaw tightened at my direct challenge. "The fundamentals of scaling a business are universal. The board agrees that your attachment to certain aspects of the company has become an obstacle to growth." Gregory cleared his throat. "Claire, we value everything you've built. This isn't a reflection on your vision. It's simply that different growth stages require different skill sets." I looked directly at him. This man who had enthusiastically invested $4 million just 18 months ago, specifically citing my authentic leadership and deep understanding of the wellness market as key factors in his decision. "Interesting," I replied. "And was this conclusion reached before or after my husband and Natalie began their relationship?" The room went deadly silent. Mira suddenly became very interested in her tablet. Gregory shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That's completely inappropriate," Natalie hissed, her professional veneer cracking. Is it? I asked, still unnervingly calm. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems highly relevant to a discussion about company leadership. Richard's face had gone rigid. We're not here to discuss personal matters. This decision is about business strategy and growth potential. I see. I nodded thoughtfully. Then you won't mind if we discuss some business strategies I've been developing. Without waiting for a response, I opened my laptop, projecting onto the screen behind me. Before we proceed with any transition discussions, I'd like to direct everyone's attention to Section 7.3 of our operating agreement. Richard frowned, clearly trying to recall what Section 7.3 contained. Natalie looked confused. She'd never bothered to read our founding documents. I began to read aloud. In the event of any proposed change to chief executive status or removal of a founder from operational control, all intellectual property licensing agreements revert to their original terms as established at company formation. The confusion on Richard's face was telling. He had no idea what this meant. For those who weren't with us at the beginning, I continued pleasantly, Lumina Wellness doesn't own its core IP. The company licenses the methodology, programming, and systems from Clarion Holdings, my separate LLC established 3 years before Lumina was formed. I paused, letting this sink in. The current licensing agreement is extremely favorable to Lumina. $1 per year for exclusive global rights. But under Section 7.3, if I'm removed as CEO, the licensing terms immediately revert to market rate. Gregory sat forward, alarm crossing his face. What exactly does that mean in financial terms? I smiled for the first time since the meeting began. It means Lumina would immediately owe Clarion Holdings approximately $2.3 million in annual licensing fees, plus back payments calculated at market rate for the past 5 years. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Richard's face had gone from confident to confused to concerned in the span of 30 seconds. Natalie's triumphant smile had vanished completely. That's not possible, Richard stammered, his corporate polish cracking. The company methodology is part of Lumina's assets. It's listed in our pitch decks, our investor materials. It's listed as a licensed asset, I corrected him. Check page 42 of the Series A documents. The licensing arrangement is clearly disclosed, though few people read that deeply into the legal section. I watched as Gregory hurriedly flipped through documents on his tablet, no doubt searching for the reference. His expression told me the moment he found it. This is a technicality, Richard insisted, regaining some composure. The board can challenge this arrangement. It's clearly designed to prevent proper corporate governance. By all means, challenge it, I replied evenly. But you should know that the arrangement was vetted by 3 separate law firms during our funding rounds. It's standard practice for founders to protect their intellectual property through licensing arrangements. I hadn't always been this prepared, this strategic. When I started Lumina 8 years ago, I was just a yoga instructor with a vision. After burning out from a high-stress marketing career, I'd found healing through yoga, meditation, and holistic wellness. I developed my own methodology combining Eastern practices with modern science, something accessible to stressed professionals. Like my former self, my first studio was literally in our converted garage. Richard, then my supportive husband of 2 years, had helped me install the bamboo flooring and paint the walls that soothing shade of blue. We celebrated with cheap champagne when I signed up my 10th client. Within 18 months, word of mouth had filled my classes. I leased a small commercial space, then another. By year 3, I had developed certification programs for other instructors to learn my methodology, creating the foundation for what would become the Lumina approach. Richard had his own career, then working for a mid-sized tech company. He would listen to my business challenges over dinner, offering occasional advice, but generally supporting from the sidelines. It wasn't until Lumina had 5 locations and was attracting interest from investors that he suggested coming on board. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You need someone who understands the business side, he'd said. You're the vision, the heart. Let me handle the growth strategy and finances. It had made sense at the time. Richard had business school credentials and corporate experience I lacked. When we raised our first significant funding, $4 million from Gregory's firm, Richard became official COO while I remained CEO and Chief Wellness Officer. The board was initially just the 3 of us, me, Richard, and Gregory. The company grew rapidly after that. We expanded to 12 locations across 3 states. We launched our digital platform with online classes and wellness tracking. Our product, line of sustainable yoga equipment and branded supplements, took off. What had started as my personal healing journey had blossomed into a wellness empire valued at $28 million. Then came the Series B discussions 6 months ago. Richard argued that we needed more professional leadership on the board. He suggested bringing in Natalie, who had recently joined as marketing director after a stint at a consumer products company. I had reservations. She seemed more focused on trendiness than authentic wellness, but Richard insisted her digital marketing background was crucial for our next growth phase. I gave in. My mistake. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. Richard and Natalie's strategy meetings that ran late into the evening. The sudden business trips they both needed to take to the same cities. The shift in company materials toward more commercialized messaging that felt increasingly distant from our original mission. But I had been busy developing our new trauma-informed wellness program, working directly with practitioners and clients. I trusted my husband to handle the business operations with integrity. Another mistake. If I could interject, Mira spoke up, breaking me from my thoughts. As the newest investor who had led our Series B round, she had the most to lose if Lumina suddenly faced massive licensing fees. Perhaps we've moved too hastily here. Claire's leadership has been instrumental to the company's success. Gregory nodded, clearly recalculating his position. I think we should table this leadership discussion and review the legal arrangements in more detail. Richard wasn't ready to concede. This is just a negotiating tactic. Claire, be reasonable. You don't want to damage the company out of spite. I met his gaze steadily. Spite? Is that what you call protecting what I built? What about the spite of conspiring with your girlfriend to push out your wife from her own company? Natalie flinched visibly at the directness, but I continued before she could respond. This isn't a negotiating tactic, Richard. It's a legitimate business arrangement that protected my intellectual property while allowing Lumina to grow. I created that methodology through years of study, practice, and refinement. Long before Lumina existed, before our marriage, before any of you were involved. I closed my laptop and stood up. I suggest we adjourn this meeting. The board clearly needs time to review the full implications of the licensing agreements and reconsider this ill-advised leadership change. Richard stood as well, his height. Usually intimidating, but not today. This isn't over. You're right about that, I replied calmly. But it's not proceeding the way you planned either. As I walked toward the door, Gregory called after me. Claire, we should discuss reasonable terms for moving forward. Everyone wants what's best for Lumina. I paused at the threshold. What's best for Lumina is leadership that understands its core values and mission. Once you've reviewed all the documentation, I'm happy to discuss the company's future, a future that respects its foundations. With that, I left them sitting in the sleek conference room of the headquarters I had designed, the betrayal still fresh but no longer debilitating. Because unlike Richard and Natalie, I had prepared for this day. And their failure to do their due diligence was about to become very expensive. I drove home in a state of focused calm, the kind I'd teach in my advanced meditation classes, acknowledging the emotional storm beneath while maintaining clarity above. My modern craftsman house, once a symbol of what Richard and I had built together, now felt like contested territory. I parked in the driveway but didn't go inside. Instead, I called my sister Maya. "They made their move," I said when she answered. "Finally," Maya replied. She wasn't surprised. I'd confided my suspicions months ago. As a corporate attorney herself, she had helped me prepare. "How did it go?" "Exactly as expected. They didn't do their homework." "Did you drop the IP bomb?" "I did," I confirmed, feeling a grim satisfaction. Gregory looked like he might have a stroke. Richard tried to dismiss it as a technicality. Maya snorted. "A multi-million-dollar technicality. What's your next move?" "I'm heading to the office to collect some personal items, then checking into the hotel. I don't want to be home when Richard returns." "Good plan. Document everything. I'll meet you for dinner at 7. After hanging up, I drove to our flagship location in downtown Portland. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the minimalist Lumina sign, my design, inspired by my grandmother Luminara's handwriting. Inside, the space was quiet between class sessions, the bamboo floors gleaming, the subtle scent of our signature essential oil blend hanging in the air. All of it executed according to my vision. In my office, I began carefully selecting items: my grandmother's framed photograph, journals containing my original methodology notes, a few personal plants, and the stone meditation bowl a client had gifted me after claiming our program had saved her life. I left everything else: the furnishings I'd selected, the awards we'd won, the vision boards for future programs. As I was placing the last items in a box, there was a soft knock at my door. I looked up to find Teresa, our longest-serving instructor, and now head of practitioner development. "Claire, is everything okay? There are rumors flying around." I sighed. News traveled fast. "Not really. There's been a disagreement at the board level about the company's leadership." Teresa's eyes widened as she noticed my packing. "They're not pushing you out? They can't do that. Lumina is you." "They're trying," I admitted. "But it's complicated." "Is it?" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Is it true about Richard and Natalie?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak about that particular betrayal without my careful composure cracking. Teresa's expression hardened. "That explains the changes they've been pushing through. Natalie's been meeting with instructors behind your back, talking about modernizing our approach. More Instagram-friendly poses, flashier classes. She keeps saying we need to evolve beyond the traditional Lumina method." This was new information. "How many instructors has she spoken to?" "Most of the newer ones. But those of us who've been here from the beginning, we've been pushing back. We came to Lumina because of your approach, not to become another soulless fitness brand." I felt a wave of gratitude for this unexpected alliance. "Thank you for telling me, Teresa. And for staying true to our mission." "Of course," she said firmly. "So what happens now?" I considered how much to share. Teresa was not just a colleague but a friend, and apparently an ally when I needed one most. Now we see if the board comes to their senses when they realize how much Richard and Natalie have misled them about their ability to sideline me. She nodded thoughtfully. "And if they don't? Then Lumina will face some difficult choices." I finished packing my box and gave Teresa a genuine hug. Keep teaching. The true method, that's the most important thing right now. As I left the building, my phone buzzed with texts and calls. Richard, Gregory, even Natalie. I ignored them all. They had made their move without consulting me. Now they could wait for my response. At the boutique hotel downtown, far from any Lumina location, I checked into a suite I'd reserved days ago, anticipating I might need neutral territory. I'd barely settled in when my phone rang again. This time it was Gregory. I decided to answer. Hello, Gregory. Claire, he sounded relieved. We need to talk. This situation has become unnecessarily adversarial. Has it? It seemed quite deliberate. When you all voted to remove me this morning, he cleared his throat. Perhaps we moved too hastily. After reviewing the licensing documentation more thoroughly, I have concerns about the approach Richard proposed. I imagine you do, I replied. Particularly the part where Lumina would suddenly owe millions in licensing fees while simultaneously losing the person who created and evolves the core methodology. Exactly, he admitted. Look, I think we should reconvene. Without Richard and Natalie present. Just you, me, and Mira, to discuss a more sensible path forward. I considered this. Gregory was clearly trying to salvage the situation now that he understood his investment was at risk. But meeting without Richard would only escalate tensions and potentially give Richard ammunition to claim I was manipulating investors behind his back. Exactly what he had done to me. I appreciate the offer, Gregory, but any board discussions should include all board members. That's proper governance. But Richard is clearly conflicted here, Gregory protested. His personal relationship with Natalie. Yes, he is conflicted, I agreed. That's something that should have been addressed before today's vote. Don't. You think? Gregory sighed. You're right. This has been mishandled. But Claire, we need to find a solution that preserves Lumina's value and trajectory. I'm glad we agree on that much. I suggest we meet tomorrow morning, full board. And in the meantime, I recommend everyone thoroughly review not just the IP licensing agreement, but also the non-compete clauses for senior leadership and the client relationship provisions. There was a pause. Are there other issues we should be aware of? Let's just say the IP licensing isn't the only detail that seems to have been overlooked in this rush to new leadership. After hanging up, I allowed myself a small smile. The first cracks were showing. Gregory wasn't a fool. He was a businessman who had invested significant capital in Lumina. Now that he understood Richard's coup threatened that investment, he was already recalculating his position. My phone buzzed again. Richard. This time I read the message. This is childish, Claire. Running away instead of discussing the situation like adults. Your licensing trick won't hold up. Call me so we can work out a reasonable transition. I didn't respond. Richard still thought this was a negotiating tactic, a temporary obstacle to his plans. He had no idea what was coming next. The next morning, I arrived at Lumina headquarters 15 minutes early for our 9 a.m. meeting. I had slept surprisingly well at the hotel, perhaps because for the first time in months, I wasn't sharing a bed with someone plotting against me. I wore my favorite power outfit, a tailored charcoal suit over a soft blue silk top that matched our company colors, paired with the moonstone pendant my grandmother had left me, my armor and my talisman. Rachel, our head of operations and someone I trusted implicitly, met me at the entrance. Everything's set up in the conference room, she said quietly, falling into step beside me. And I've pulled the files you requested. Thank you. Any sense of the mood this morning? She gave me a wry smile. Tense. Richard came in at 7 a.m. and has been locked in his office with Natalie. Gregory arrived 10 minutes ago and went straight to the small conference room. He's on a call. Looks serious. I nodded, taking this in. And Mira? Not here yet, but her assistant called to confirm the meeting. We reached my office, technically still mine until the board officially removed me, and I set down my briefcase. Rachel, there's something else I need. The visitor logs from the past 3 months. She raised an eyebrow but nodded. I'll have them sent to your email right away. At precisely 9 a.m., I walked into the conference room. Richard and Natalie were already seated on one side of the table, Gregory on the other. Mira hurried in just behind me, her expression carefully neutral. Richard looked up, his face a mask of forced pleasantness. Claire. Thank you for agreeing to this follow-up discussion. As if I'd been the one to request it. Classic Richard, always reframing reality to position himself as the reasonable party. Of course, I replied, taking my seat at the head of the table. I'm always willing to discuss Lumina's best interests. Richard cleared his throat. After yesterday's revelation about the IP licensing structure, we've been exploring options that could work for everyone. Have you? I asked pleasantly. Yes, he continued. While the current agreement does give your holding company certain rights, we believe there's room for a reasonable renegotiation that would allow for leadership transition while maintaining favorable licensing terms. I smiled. What exactly did you have in mind? Richard seemed encouraged by my apparent openness. We propose amending the licensing agreement to maintain current terms regardless of leadership changes. In exchange, we'd offer you an enhanced severance package, say 7 years' salary instead of 5. Plus a permanent board seat and a founder emeritus role for public-facing events. So you still want me out, just with a better golden parachute and a ceremonial title, I summarized. We want to honor your contributions while allowing Lumina to evolve, Natalie interjected, her voice honey-sweet. I noticed she had dressed down. Today, wearing a modest blouse rather than her usual designer outfits, playing the professional rather than the usurper. Before we discuss that proposal, I said, opening my laptop, I'd like to address some other matters that have come to my attention. I pulled up a document and projected it onto the screen at the end of the room. This is a summary of meeting records from our flagship location for the past 3 months. Could someone explain why Natalie has been holding unauthorized meetings with our instructors to discuss modernizing our core methodology? Richard frowned. Those weren't unauthorized. As marketing directors don't have authority to revise our wellness approach, I interrupted. That falls under my purview as Chief Wellness Officer, as clearly defined in our operating structure. Natalie's cheeks flushed. I was simply gathering feedback. Were you? I pulled up another document. Because according to these messages sent to our instructor team, you were introducing mandatory adjustments to our signature programs. Adjustments? Neither approved by me nor consistent with our evidence-based methodology. Gregory leaned forward, frowning. I was told all program changes were collaborative decisions based on client feedback and market research. That's what I was told as well, I replied. But apparently that wasn't the case. Richard waved his hand dismissively. This is a minor operational disagreement, not a board matter. Actually, I continued, pulling up a third document, it becomes a board matter when it threatens our certification program, which generates 22% of our annual revenue. 3 of our most senior certified instructors have written to me directly, expressing concerns that the changes being pushed through would compromise the integrity of the Lumina method so severely that they would withdraw from the certification program. Mira spoke for the first time. That would pose a significant revenue risk, not to mention potential reputation damage. Precisely, I agreed. But there's more. I clicked to the next screen. This is an email exchange between Richard and Jason Miller at Velocity Fitness from 2 months ago, discussing, and I quote, potential integration of Lumina's wellness programs into the Velocity Fitness ecosystem. Richard's face went pale. Velocity Fitness is our primary competitor, I explained to Mira, who had joined the board too recently to know all the players. They've tried to acquire us twice before. It was a preliminary conversation, Richard protested, merely exploring options. Without board knowledge or approval, I pointed out, and there have been 7 such preliminary conversations in the past 60 days, including 3 in-person meetings. Gregory's expression had darkened considerably. This is the first I'm hearing of any discussions with Velocity. That's because they weren't disclosed, I said. Just as the changing nature of Richard and Natalie's relationship wasn't disclosed, despite both representing clear conflicts of interest. Richard slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. You're trying to distract from the real issue. Your refusal to accept that Lumina has outgrown your leadership. Has it? I asked calmly. Or have you simply wanted control badly enough to manipulate the situation? Because from where I sit, it appears you've been systematically undermining my position while pursuing undisclosed side discussions with competitors and implementing unauthorized changes to our core product. I turned to Gregory and Mira. As investors, you should also know that our client retention rate has dropped 12% at locations where Natalie's modernized approach has been implemented, compared to locations still operating under the original methodology. Mira frowned. The quarterly reports showed overall retention increasing. Because the numbers were aggregated, I explained. When broken down by location and program type, a different picture emerges. I clicked to a chart showing retention, rates by location. The 3 studios where Natalie had focused her changes showed a clear downward trend, while the others remained stable or improved. Gregory removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. Why are we only seeing this analysis now? Because it was conducted by my team last week, after instructors raised concerns. I intended to present it at next month's strategy meeting. But given yesterday's events, it seemed more urgent. The room fell silent as Gregory and Mira studied the data on screen. Richard's jaw was tight, his earlier confidence evaporating. Natalie attempted to salvage the situation. Temporary fluctuations during program updates are normal. The long-term growth potential. Would you stake your career on that claim? I interrupted, turning to face her directly. Because the data shows clients specifically citing departure from our core principles as their reason for cancellation. I closed my laptop. So to return to your proposal, Richard, you want me to agree to maintain favorable licensing terms while stepping aside for leadership that has demonstrated questionable judgment, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and a willingness to undermine the very methodology that built this company. I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. I think I'll pass. Richard's composure was crumbling. The confident executive who had tried to orchestrate my removal was now flushed with anger, his carefully constructed narrative falling apart. This is manipulation, he snapped. You're cherry-picking data and incidents to create a distorted picture. Everything I've presented is factual and documented, I replied evenly, unlike the growth projections in last month's board deck, which painted a very different picture than our actual performance metrics. Gregory's head snapped up. What are you talking about? I reached into my briefcase and extracted a folder, sliding it across the table to him. The revenue projections presented to the board showed a 37% growth trajectory based on the modernization initiatives, but our actual numbers from the test locations show a 7% revenue decline. Gregory opened the folder, scanning the contents with increasing concern. These figures are dramatically different from what we reviewed. Because the board was shown the projections, not the preliminary results, I explained. Results that were available 2 weeks before our last meeting but somehow didn't make it into the presentation. Richard's jaw tightened. Those results were incomplete and misleading. We needed more data before drawing conclusions. Yet you had enough confidence in your approach to move forward with ousting me, I observed. Mira, who had been quietly absorbing everything, finally spoke. Richard, did you withhold performance data that contradicted your proposed strategy? His hesitation was damning. I exercised judgment about what information was relevant and reliable. Early results from limited test cases aren't indicative of long-term performance. That wasn't your decision to make, Mira replied sharply. As COO, you're obligated to present complete and accurate information to the board, especially when it directly relates to strategic discussions. Natalie, sensing the tide turning, attempted to redirect. We should focus on moving forward constructively. These accusations aren't accusations, I interrupted. They're documented facts, and they demonstrate a pattern of behavior that raises serious questions about Richard's judgment and transparency as an executive. I turned back to the investors. Which brings us to the fundamental question. What kind of company do we want Lumina to be? The authentic wellness brand our clients trust, or a commercialized fitness trend chasing quarterly numbers at the expense of our core values? Gregory sighed heavily. Claire, no one is questioning the value of your methodology or vision. That's precisely why we invested. But companies evolve and sometimes founders need to step aside, I finished for him. I'm familiar with the conventional wisdom. But that wisdom assumes the founder is the limiting factor rather than the essential ingredient. I leaned forward. The irony here is that I've never opposed growth or evolution. What I've opposed is diluting our core principles for short-term gains. That's why clients come to Lumina instead of Velocity or other competitors, because we offer something authentic in an industry full of empty promises, Richard scoffed. This romanticized vision is exactly the problem. You can't scale authenticity, Claire. At some point, you need standardization and mass market appeal. Actually, you absolutely can scale authenticity, I countered. That's what our certification program does. It scales our methodology without compromising its integrity. That's why it's our fastest-growing revenue segment, with a 94% renewal rate. I paused, gathering my thoughts. But let's be clear about what's really happening here. This isn't about my leadership limitations. It's about Richard wanting control of the company and using his relationship with Natalie to consolidate power. That's absurd, Natalie protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? I asked. Then explain the 7 meetings with Velocity Fitness. Explain why you've been implementing methodology changes despite instructor resistance. Explain why our most experienced practitioners are threatening to leave. Neither of them had a response. Mira cleared her throat. I think we need to take a step back. Yesterday's vote was clearly premature and based on incomplete information. I agree, Gregory said, closing the folder. I move that we table any leadership changes pending a full review of company performance, the concerns raised today, and proper evaluation of the intellectual property implications. Richard recognized his position was weakening. Fine. A review. Makes sense. But Claire's accusations don't change the fundamental challenges with her leadership style. She's resistant to necessary evolution. Like the evolution you've been discussing with our main competitor? I interjected. His face darkened. Those discussions were exploratory. Nothing was decided. Yet you didn't disclose them to the board, I pointed out. Just as you didn't disclose the real performance data from the locations implementing your changes. Gregory raised a hand to stop the exchange. Enough. We'll adjourn for now and reconvene after a proper review. In the meantime, no major strategic or personnel changes should be implemented. Richard nodded stiffly, but I wasn't finished. Before we adjourn, there's one more matter we need to address, I said. Given the clear conflicts of interest that have been revealed, I believe Richard should recuse himself from operational decisions regarding our methodology and instructor relationships, pending the review. That's half my job, Richard protested, which you should have considered before commencing a personal relationship with a direct report and pursuing undisclosed discussions with competitors, I replied calmly. Gregory and Mira exchanged glances. Claire's request is reasonable, Mira stated. Standard corporate governance would require recusal in situations involving potential conflicts of interest. Fine, Richard snapped. But this works both ways. Claire should also recuse herself from decisions related to the certification program since she's clearly using it as leverage. I smiled. I'd be happy to have an independent evaluation of the certification program's performance and instructor satisfaction. In fact, I welcome it. My confidence clearly unsettled him. He had expected me to resist external scrutiny of my domain, not embrace it. The meeting adjourned with tensions still high, but the power dynamic fundamentally altered. As everyone gathered their materials, I noticed Natalie whisper something to Richard, her expression anxious. Gregory approached, me as the others left. "Claire, could we speak privately?" I nodded, and once the room had cleared, he sighed heavily. "I owe you an apology. I should have asked more questions before yesterday's vote." "Yes, you should have," I agreed, not making it easy for him. He grimaced. In my defense, Richard presented a compelling case about scaling challenges and had the data to back it up. Or so I thought. That's the problem with data, Gregory. It can be curated to tell almost any story. Indeed. He hesitated. So what happens now? Truthfully, I considered the question. That depends on whether the board wants to salvage this situation or continue down the path Richard has started. And if we want to salvage it, then Richard needs to go, I said simply. His judgment is compromised, and he's demonstrated willingness to manipulate information for personal gain. That's not correctable with oversight or recusal. Gregory winced. That's a significant step. So was attempting to remove the founder under false pretenses, I pointed out. Actions have consequences. He nodded slowly. I'll need to discuss this with Mira. But Claire, regardless of how this resolves, there are legitimate questions about company growth and strategy that need addressing. I've never been opposed to those conversations, I replied, just to having them under false pretenses or with rigged outcomes. When you're ready for an honest discussion about Lumina's future, so am I. As Gregory left, I remained in the conference room, gathering my thoughts. The battle wasn't won, but the first major counterattack had landed. Richard had expected me to be emotional, reactive, easy to dismiss. Instead, I had come prepared with facts and documentation that undermined his entire narrative. Now I just needed to prepare for his next move. Because one thing I knew about my husband, he wouldn't concede defeat easily, especially not to me. I spent the rest of the day holed up in my office with Rachel and our financial analyst, Jerome. We methodically went through company records, communications and performance data, building a comprehensive picture of what had been happening behind my back. There's a pattern here, Jerome said, pointing to a series of expenditures. Marketing budgets increased 43% in the locations implementing the modernized programs, masking their actual performance decline. When you normalize for the additional spending, they're underperforming legacy locations by nearly 22%. I nodded, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. So they've been burning cash to create the illusion of successful transformation. Exactly, he confirmed. At this burn rate, those locations would become unprofitable within 7 months. Rachel, who had been reviewing emails, looked up from her screen. Claire, you need to see this. I found an email chain between Richard and Velocity's CEO that wasn't in the records you presented this morning. She turned her laptop toward me. The email was dated just 3 weeks ago with the subject line Term Sheet Review. My stomach clenched as I read Richard's message. Jason, reviewed the updated terms. The valuation still seems low given Lumina's growth trajectory and IP assets. However, I understand your concerns about the transition period. Once the leadership change is complete, we can move forward more aggressively with integration planning. Until then, our discussions should remain confidential. He was negotiating a sale, I said, the full betrayal finally clear. This wasn't just about pushing me out. It was about selling Lumina to our biggest competitor. Without board approval or knowledge, Rachel added. That's not just unethical, it's potentially illegal. Forward this to my personal email immediately, I instructed. And Jerome, I need a complete analysis of how the methodology changes align with Velocity's existing programs. As they worked, my phone buzzed with a text from Maya. Any updates? Dinner still on? I replied, Major developments. Dinner definitely on. Bring your legal brain. By 6:30 p.m., we had assembled a damning collection of evidence. Richard hadn't just been undermining me. He'd been systematically preparing Lumina for absorption into Velocity, restructuring our core offerings to match their commercialized approach while hiding the negative impact on performance. The methodology changes Natalie had been implementing weren't random. They were specifically designed to align our programs with Velocity's model, essentially beginning the integration before any acquisition was finalized. I need copies of everything, I told Rachel and Jerome. And I need absolute discretion. No discussions about this with anyone, not even other executives. They both nodded solemnly. They understood the stakes. What are you going to do? Rachel asked. First, I'm going to have dinner with my sister. Then, I'm going to save my company. I met Maya at an upscale restaurant far from any Lumina location, in a private dining room I'd reserved using my personal credit card. Her eyebrows rose as I walked her through what we'd discovered. This goes beyond corporate politics, she said, her legal mind clearly assessing the implications. Negotiating a company sale without board approval, concealing material information from investors, implementing strategic changes to facilitate an undisclosed acquisition. These are serious governance violations. Serious enough to force Richard out? Maya nodded. More than enough. Gregory and Mira would be negligent in their fiduciary duties if they didn't take action once they see this evidence. They could personally face liability if they knowingly allowed this behavior to continue. And what about Natalie? As a board member who participated in or knew about these activities, she's equally exposed. But there's another angle here we should consider. Maya leaned forward. The HR implications of their relationship. When did it start? I thought back. I first suspected about 4 months ago, but based on their behavior, it probably began shortly after she joined. Which means their relationship likely began while he was directly involved in her performance reviews and compensation decisions. That's a textbook conflict of interest and potential violation of company policies. I hadn't even considered that angle. Richard had championed Natalie's rapid promotion to marketing director and her subsequent board appointment. If their relationship predated those decisions, it represented yet another layer of impropriety. So what's my next move? I asked. Maya sipped her wine thoughtfully. You need to meet with Gregory and Mira separately, not as a formal board meeting, but as a major shareholder concerned about governance issues. Present the evidence methodically, emphasizing the risks to the company and to them personally as fiduciaries. And if they still back Richard? They won't, Maya said confidently. Not with what you've shown me. This isn't just about who leads the company anymore. It's about potential legal exposure. No rational investor would ignore these red flags. You don't know Richard, I countered. He can be incredibly persuasive when cornered. He might have contingency plans we haven't discovered yet. Maya's expression turned serious. Then we prepare for that possibility too. I'll draft a whistleblower complaint to the SEC outlining the governance concerns. We'll keep it in reserve. Only file if absolutely necessary. I nodded, though the idea of taking such a nuclear option made my stomach turn. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that couldn't believe how completely Richard had betrayed not just our marriage, but the basic principles of business ethics. My phone buzzed with a text from Gregory. Need to meet first thing tomorrow. Critical issues to discuss. My office? 7:30 a.m.? I showed it to Maya, who raised an eyebrow. Interesting timing. Something's happening behind the scenes. Should I go? Absolutely. But not alone and not without preparation. She pulled out her laptop. Let's outline your talking points and assemble the key evidence you should bring. For the next 2 hours, we crafted a careful strategy. By the time we finished dinner, I had a clear plan and a newfound confidence. Whatever Richard was planning, I would be ready. When I returned to my hotel room that evening, I found a thick manila envelope that had been slipped under my door. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. You should see this. Not everyone is who they appear to be. The handwriting wasn't familiar. Cautiously, I inserted the drive into my laptop, scanning it for viruses before opening its contents. The drive contained a single folder labeled Velocity Meetings. Inside were audio, recordings with dates from the past 3 months. With mounting dread and curiosity, I clicked on the most recent file. Richard's voice emerged from my speakers. Once Claire's out, we'll need to move quickly. The licensing issue is a complication, but not insurmountable. Our lawyers think we can challenge the arrangement as an improper corporate governance mechanism. Second voice, presumably Jason from Velocity, responded, "And the board is fully on board with the acquisition after she's removed?" "They don't know about the acquisition yet," Richard admitted. "We needed to handle the leadership change first, but they're supportive of exploring strategic partnerships, which gives us cover." "And your colleague on the inside? She's reliable?" Richard laughed. "Natalie? Absolutely. She knows exactly what her role is in all this." The recording continued for another 15 minutes, detailing plans to dismantle Lumina's distinctive methodology and absorb its most profitable elements into Velocity's operation. By the time it ended, I was shaking, not with anger or hurt, but with a cold, clear certainty about what needed to happen next. I immediately called Maya. "I need you at that meeting tomorrow," I said without preamble, "and we need to adjust our strategy. This just got much bigger than a leadership dispute." At 7:15 a.m., Maya and I arrived at Gregory's office in downtown Portland. His firm, Pinnacle Ventures, occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the Willamette River. The early morning light cast long shadows across the city as we rode the elevator in silence. "Remember," Maya said as we approached the reception desk, "stay calm, stick to facts, and let the evidence speak for itself." I nodded, clutching my leather portfolio containing printouts of the most damning documents, a USB drive with the audio recordings, and a legal brief Maya had prepared outlining the various corporate governance violations. Gregory's assistant showed us into a spacious conference room where we found not just Gregory waiting, but Mira as well. Their expressions were grave. "Claire," Gregory said, rising to greet me, "and you must be Maya. Thank you both for coming." "Good morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I assume from your message that there have been developments?" Gregory nodded. "Significant ones. But first, I want to apologize for how this situation has been handled. It's become clear that we didn't exercise proper oversight." "That's putting it mildly," Maya commented. Mira leaned forward. "We've spent most of the night reviewing company records after yesterday's revelations. What we've found is troubling." "Specifically?" I prompted. Gregory slid a folder across the table. "Financial irregularities in the marketing budget allocations, unauthorized revisions to instructor contracts, and most concerning, evidence of undisclosed negotiations with Velocity Fitness." So they had discovered at least some of what I already knew. But how much? "Richard has been busy," I observed. "Yes," Mira agreed. "But he's not alone. We found communications suggesting Natalie has been coordinating with Velocity's marketing team for months, sharing proprietary information about our client profiles and program performance. That was new information, even to me. I kept my expression neutral, letting them continue. Gregory removed his glasses, looking suddenly older and more tired. "Claire, I need to ask you directly. Did you know about any of this before yesterday?" "I suspected something was wrong," I answered honestly. "But I only confirmed the extent of it in the past 48 hours. I opened my portfolio and extracted the first set of documents. However, what you've found is only part of the story. This goes beyond financial irregularities or unauthorized discussions." Maya nodded encouragingly as I laid out the evidence methodically. The email chain about the term sheet, the financial analysis showing how marketing budgets were manipulated to hide performance declines, the documented methodology changes designed to align with Velocity's programs. Gregory and Mira examined each document in silence, their expressions growing increasingly troubled. "There's more," I said finally. placing the USB drive on the table. Last night I received this anonymously. It contains recordings of meetings between Richard and Velocity's CEO discussing their acquisition plans. I played a short excerpt, just enough to establish the authenticity and gravity of the content. Richard's voice filled the room, coolly discussing how to dismantle the company I had built once I was removed from leadership. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was deafening. "This is," Gregory began, then stopped, apparently at a loss for words. "Corporate malfeasance," Maya finished for him. "Breach of fiduciary duty, potentially securities fraud, depending on what representations have been made to investors." Mira, who had been taking notes throughout, set down her pen. "Why haven't you gone public with this? Or to the authorities?" It was a fair question, one Maya had asked me last night. "Because despite everything, I still care about Lumina," I replied. "A public scandal would damage the company, hurt our employees and clients, and potentially destroy what I've spent 8 years building. My goal isn't vengeance. It's protecting Lumina's integrity and future." Gregory nodded slowly, seemingly reassessing me. "What do you want?" "First, Richard and Natalie's immediate removal from the company and board," I stated firmly. "Their actions have demonstrated they cannot be trusted with any role at Lumina." "Agreed," Mira said without hesitation. "That's non-negotiable at this point. Second, a board restructuring with additional independent directors who understand and value Lumina's core mission," I continued. "The current governance clearly failed to provide adequate oversight." Gregory winced but nodded. "Also reasonable." Third, formal documentation acknowledging the importance of the original Lumina methodology and establishing protections against future attempts to dilute or commercialize it for short-term gains. And finally, I concluded, a revised executive structure that clarifies my role as both CEO and Chief Wellness Officer with appropriate checks and balances that don't undermine the founder's vision. Maya added, "We've prepared a term sheet outlining these requirements in detail." She extracted the document from my portfolio and slid it across the table. Gregory and Mira leaned in together to review it. "These terms are aggressive," Gregory commented after a moment. "They're necessary," I countered. What Richard attempted wasn't just a power grab. It was a fundamental betrayal of Lumina's mission and stakeholders. These measures ensure it can't happen again. Mira looked up from the document. "What happens if we don't agree to these terms?" Maya answered before I could. "Then my sister will be forced to consider other options, including potential legal action against board members who failed in their fiduciary duties by allowing these activities to continue." It was a threat, elegantly delivered. Gregory and Mira exchanged glances. "We need time to review this properly," Gregory said finally, "and to consult with our attorneys." "Of course," I agreed. "But Richard and Natalie's removal needs to happen immediately, today, before they can do any further damage." Mira nodded. "On that point, we're aligned. In fact," she checked her watch, "they're being notified of their suspension pending board action at this very moment." I blinked in surprise. "You've already initiated the process? After what we discovered last night, it would have been negligent not to," Gregory explained. "Whatever happens next, their positions at Lumina are untenable." For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lifting. Richard and Natalie were being removed, not because of our personal drama, but because their actions had left the board no choice. "There's one more thing you should know," Mira said, her expression serious. "Last night, after our initial discoveries, we contacted Jason Miller at Velocity Fitness directly. He confirmed the acquisition discussions, but claims he was led to believe the board was aware and supportive." "He's trying to distance himself," Maya observed. "Undoubtedly," Mira agreed. "But he also revealed something interesting. Apparently, Richard approached them, not the other way around. He pitched the acquisition shortly after Natalie joined Lumina." The timeline suddenly clarified in my mind. So their relationship, her rapid promotion to the board, the methodology, changes. It was all part of an orchestrated plan from the beginning. Gregory nodded grimly. It appears so. The question now is how we move forward from here. I sat back, feeling a strange mix of vindication and sadness. We rebuild. Properly this time, with the right people and the right governance. Starting with Richard and Natalie's formal removal, Mira confirmed. As if on cue, Gregory's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his eyebrows shot up. Well, this is interesting. Richard is demanding an emergency board meeting. Says he has evidence of your sabotage of company initiatives. I couldn't help but laugh. Of course he does. Counterpunching is his specialty. Should we be concerned? Mira asked. I shook my head. No, let him have his meeting. I'm ready. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for noon at Lumina headquarters. In the intervening hours, I returned to my hotel to prepare, while Maya worked with Gregory and Mira's legal teams to finalize the terms for Richard and Natalie's removal. He's desperate, Maya told me over the phone. According to Gregory, Richard was blindsided by the suspension notice. Apparently, he thought he still had the board's confidence despite yesterday's revelations. That's Richard, I replied, sorting through my notes. He's always believed he could talk his way out of anything. What about Natalie? She's already lawyered up. Smart move on her part. She's positioning herself as following Richard's lead rather than being an equal partner in the scheme. I sighed. She's throwing him under the bus. Can't say I'm surprised. When I arrived, at Lumina headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Employees huddled in small groups, whispering as I walked by. News of the executive drama had clearly spread beyond the boardroom. Teresa intercepted me in the hallway, her expression concerned. Claire, what's happening? Security escorted Richard out this morning, and HR has been conducting interviews with the marketing team all day. There's been a significant governance issue identified, I said carefully. I can't share details yet, but there will be an all-hands meeting once things are resolved. She lowered her voice. The instructors are worried. Rumors are flying. That Velocity is buying us out and dismantling the methodology. I squeezed her arm reassuringly. That's not happening. Trust me. The boardroom was arranged differently for this meeting. The rectangular table had been replaced with a U-shaped configuration, with Richard positioned at the open end as if standing before a tribunal. Natalie sat off to the side with her attorney, physically separated from Richard. A deliberate choice that spoke volumes. I took my seat between Gregory and Mira, directly across from Richard. Maya sat beside me, a manila folder placed precisely in front of her. Richard looked disheveled, his normally immaculate appearance showing signs of strain, but his expression remained defiant as Gregory called the meeting to order. Before we begin, Richard interjected immediately. I'd like to state for the record that this suspension is completely unwarranted and based on misleading information provided by Claire, who has clear motivation to undermine my position. Gregory's expression remained impassive. Your objection is noted. However, the suspension was based on documented evidence of unauthorized negotiations with Velocity Fitness and misrepresentation of company performance data, both serious violations of your fiduciary duties. Those discussions were exploratory, Richard insisted. Standard practice for any executive looking to maximize company value, and the performance data reflects different analytical approaches, not misrepresentation. Different analytical approaches? Mira echoed skeptically. The board was shown projected outcomes presented as actual results. That goes beyond interpretation. Richard shifted tactics, his voice taking on a reasonable, almost conciliatory tone. Look, I acknowledge communication lapses. In my enthusiasm to drive growth, perhaps I moved too independently. But these are procedural mistakes at worst, not grounds for suspension. He turned to me, his expression softening. Claire, I know our personal situation has complicated matters, but surely you don't want to damage the company we built together over what amounts to a marital disagreement and some overzealous business development. It was masterfully done, minimizing his actions while suggesting my motives were personal, rather than professional. The old Richard charm deployed with precision. "This isn't about our marriage," I replied calmly. "It's about documented attempts to sell Lumina to a competitor without board approval, while systematically undermining the company's core methodology to facilitate that sale." Richard's face hardened. "That's absurd. I've been trying to evolve the company to meet market demands, while you've resisted necessary changes out of emotional attachment to outdated approaches." He turned to the board members. "Which brings me to the real issue we should be discussing: Claire's active sabotage of company initiatives." He pulled out a folder of his own. "Over the past 3 months, Claire has undermined modernization efforts, encouraged instructor resistance to approved program changes, and manipulated certification requirements to maintain her personal control, all while hiding behind the IP licensing agreement she deceptively established." Deceptively? I raised an eyebrow. The licensing agreement was fully disclosed in our founding documents and reviewed by 3 separate law firms during funding rounds. There was nothing deceptive about it. "It was designed as a control mechanism," Richard insisted. "A poison pill to prevent proper corporate governance." Gregory cleared his throat. "The licensing agreement is actually quite standard for founder-led companies where significant IP predates the corporate entity. Our legal team confirmed this yesterday." Richard wasn't deterred. "The issue isn't the agreement's existence, but how Claire has weaponized it to resist necessary evolution. She's effectively holding the company hostage to her personal vision." "By necessary evolution, do you mean the methodology changes designed to align Lumina with Velocity's programs?" Mira asked pointedly. "The ones implemented without proper testing or approval?" Richard faltered momentarily before recovering. "Those changes were based on market research and client feedback. Any similarity to competitor offerings is coincidental and simply reflects industry best practices." Maya opened her folder and extracted a document. "Is that why you wrote to Jason?" "Miller on February 12th, and I quote, 'The methodology adjustments are proceeding as planned. By Q3, the core programs will be fully compatible with Velocity's approach, facilitating seamless integration post-acquisition.'" The color drained from Richard's face. He hadn't expected that specific email to surface. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "From Velocity," Mira replied. "Mr. Miller has been quite cooperative since we contacted him yesterday. Apparently, he was concerned about potential legal exposure once he realized the board hadn't approved the acquisition discussions." For the first time, Richard looked genuinely rattled. His gaze darted to Natalie, who was studiously avoiding eye contact with him. "Richard," Gregory said, his tone almost sympathetic, "the evidence against you is overwhelming. Unauthorized acquisition negotiations, financial misrepresentation, undisclosed conflicts of interest, implementation of strategic changes designed to facilitate a secret sale." He slid a document across the table. "This is a separation agreement. It offers reasonable financial terms in exchange for your immediate resignation from all positions at Lumina, a comprehensive non-compete clause, and a mutual non-disparagement provision." Richard didn't touch the document. "And if I refuse?" Maya answered, her voice cool and professional. "Then the board will proceed with formal termination for cause, based on documented violations of your fiduciary duty and company policies. Additionally, Lumina would be obligated to consider legal remedies for damages resulting from your actions." Richard's jaw tightened as he realized the extent of his isolation. He looked around the table, searching for any sign of support, but found none. "This is a setup," he muttered, but the fight was draining from his voice. "You've all turned against me because of her." "No, Richard," I said quietly. "They've simply seen the evidence of what you've done. This isn't about me or us or even your relationship with Natalie. It's about your willingness to sacrifice Lumina's integrity for your own benefit. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I glimpsed something like regret before his expression hardened again. "You won't get away with this," he said, but it sounded hollow even to my ears. Gregory pushed the separation agreement closer to him. "I suggest you review this with your attorney. We'll recess for 30 minutes to give you time to consider your options." As the board members stood to leave, Natalie finally spoke. "I'd like to address the board separately," she said, her voice tight with tension. "My situation is distinct from Richard's, and I have information that may be relevant to your deliberations." Richard's head snapped toward her, his expression a mix of shock and betrayal. "Natalie, what are you doing?" Her attorney placed a restraining hand on her arm. "My client will be making her own statement to the board. We request a private meeting." I couldn't help but note the irony. Richard's carefully constructed alliance was collapsing exactly as he'd tried to collapse my company. The betrayer betrayed. As we filed out of the room, I caught Richard staring at the separation agreement, the full weight of his failure finally settling on his shoulders. The 30-minute recess stretched to nearly an hour. I waited in my office, reviewing documents and responding to urgent emails, trying to maintain some semblance of normal business operations despite the corporate drama unfolding in the boardroom. Rachel knocked on my door. "The board is reassembling, and Richard's asking to speak with you privately before they reconvene." I sighed, considering the request. "Where?" "Small conference room. His attorney is with him." I nodded. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." Maya frowned when I told her, "You don't have to meet him alone." "I won't be alone. His attorney will be there," I pointed out. "And honestly, I need to face him one last time, for closure if nothing else." She reluctantly agreed, but insisted on waiting just outside the door. The small conference room felt claustrophobic compared to the spacious boardroom. Richard sat with his back to the window, his attorney, a severe-looking woman in a charcoal suit, beside him. Both stood, as I entered. 5 minutes, I said, remaining standing. Richard nodded. "My attorney will step outside to give us privacy." "That's not necessary," I began, but his attorney was already moving toward the door. "I'll be right outside if you need me, Mr. Harmon," she said, closing the door behind her. Richard's composure had deteriorated further since the earlier meeting. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it, a nervous habit I recognized from our marriage. "I've signed the agreement," he said without preamble. I nodded but said nothing. "They offered Natalie a similar deal, but with less severe restrictions," he continued, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "Apparently, her cooperation earned her more favorable terms." "She threw you under the bus," I translated. A humorless laugh escaped him. "Completely. Told them everything was my idea, that I pressured her professionally and personally, made herself out to be another victim of my ambition." I felt no satisfaction at his betrayal, only a hollow sadness at the wreckage of trust scattered around us. "Why did you ask to see me?" I asked. He met my gaze directly for the first time. I wanted to say, "I didn't start out planning this. It evolved." Into betrayal? I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. Into selling my company to our biggest competitor? Into undermining everything I built? Into creating something bigger, he insisted. "The acquisition made sense, Claire. Velocity has the infrastructure and capital we've struggled to build. The valuation was substantial. You would have been wealthy beyond imagination." "I never cared about being wealthy beyond imagination," I replied. "I cared about building something meaningful, something true to my values. You knew that. You used to respect that." He looked away. "Business isn't about values. It's about growth and adaptation." "That's where you're wrong," I said quietly. "The Most successful businesses stay true to their core purpose. They grow by deepening their commitment to what makes them unique, not by diluting it. Richard's shoulders slumped. It doesn't matter now. It's over. Yes, it is. I turned to leave, then paused. Was any of it real? Us? Your commitment to Lumina? Or was it all just a stepping stone to something else? The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, the calculated executive facade dropped, revealing something more vulnerable. It was real, he said softly. In the beginning, but somewhere along the way, I don't know. Things changed. You changed, I corrected him. He didn't deny it. Maybe. Success does that sometimes. I studied him. This man I'd shared my life and dreams with, now a stranger in a rumpled suit, defeated by his own machinations. Goodbye, Richard. As I reached for the door handle, he spoke again. Claire. I turned. You outplayed me, he admitted, a faint, rueful smile touching his lips. I never thought you had it in you. That was your biggest mistake, I replied, underestimating me. 15 minutes later, the board reconvened. Richard and Natalie were both absent, their separation agreement signed and their company access already terminated. Their nameplates had been removed from the table, the physical space reflecting their swift excision from Lumina's leadership. Gregory opened the meeting with uncharacteristic solemnity. With the immediate leadership issues addressed, we need to discuss Lumina's path forward. He turned to me. Claire, as founder and continuing CEO, what do you envision for the company's next steps? All eyes were on me. This was the moment that would define not just my leadership but Lumina's future direction. The path I chose now would set our trajectory for years to come. First, we need to stabilize, I began. The past few days have been turbulent for everyone. We'll need clear communication with our employees, instructors, and clients to reassure them about our commitment to Lumina's core values. Mira nodded encouragingly. Second, we need a thorough audit of all changes implemented during the past 6 months. Any methodology modifications that compromised our approach need to be identified and reversed. Our certification program integrity must be reaffirmed. Gregory made notes as I spoke. Third, I propose restructuring our executive team with clearer governance and accountability measures. A stronger checks and balances system would have caught Richard's activities earlier. And finally, I concluded, I want to revisit our growth strategy, not to limit it, but to ensure it aligns with our authentic mission. Lumina can expand without diluting what makes us special. In fact, I believe our most substantial growth opportunities lie in deepening our commitment to evidence-based, transformative wellness, rather than chasing trendy fitness fads. My words hung in the air as board members considered the vision I'd laid out. It wasn't a retreat to the status quo. It was a recommitment to our founding principles with improved governance and clearer growth pathways. Gregory sat back in his chair. That's a comprehensive approach. What about the board structure itself? I'd like to propose adding 2 independent directors with relevant expertise, I replied. Specifically, someone with wellness industry experience and another with a background in ethical business governance. And the IP licensing arrangement? Mira asked. Will that continue as currently structured? I believe the current arrangement has proven its value as a protection mechanism, I said carefully. However, I'm open to discussions about modifications that maintain appropriate safeguards while addressing any legitimate governance concerns. Maya gave me an approving nod. My position was reasonable but firm, offering compromise without surrendering the essential protections. One last question, Gregory said. How do you plan to address the velocity situation? They've been positioning themselves to acquire Lumina for months. They may not give up easily. I smiled for the first time in what felt like days. Actually, I have some thoughts on that front. Their interest in our methodology gives us leverage, but not for an acquisition. I'm thinking more along the lines of a limited licensing partnership that keeps Lumina independent while creating a new revenue stream. The surprise on their faces was evident. They had expected a defensive posture, not a strategic counterproposal. Would Velocity agree to that after everything that's happened? Mira asked. I believe they will, I replied confidently. Based on the communications we've seen, what they truly value is our methodology, not our physical locations or brand. A licensing arrangement gives them access to the approach without the complexity of a full acquisition, and without the significant premium they'd need to pay to acquire us outright. Gregory exchanged glances with Mira. It's an interesting approach, turning a threat into an opportunity. Exactly, I confirmed. And it reinforces that our intellectual property has substantial market value, validating both my development work and our licensing structure. By the end of the meeting, the board had unanimously approved my proposed direction, including the addition of 2 independent directors and the exploration of strategic partnerships from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. As we gathered our materials to leave, Gregory approached me privately. Claire, I want to apologize again for my role in this situation. I should have exercised better judgment. Yes, you should have, I agreed, not sugarcoating it. But what matters now is rebuilding trust and strengthening Lumina's foundation going forward. He nodded soberly. You've handled this with remarkable composure and strategic thinking. It's not what I expected. I raised an eyebrow. Because you bought into Richard's narrative about the emotional founder too attached to her creation? He had the grace to look embarrassed. Perhaps. It's a common stereotype in venture capital circles. A stereotype that costs companies their souls, I replied. The best founders aren't obstacles to growth. They're its greatest catalysts, when properly supported. The final board meeting concluded late in the afternoon, leaving me emotionally drained but resolute. My position as CEO was secure, Richard and Natalie were gone, and Lumina's future path was clear. But I knew that securing the boardroom was only the first step. I still needed to address the uncertainty rippling through the entire organization. I sat alone in my office afterward, watching the sunset paint the Portland skyline in hues of orange and purple. The enormity of the day's events settled over me like a heavy blanket. We had averted disaster, but the company was wounded, trust had been broken, relationships strained, and our culture tested. Healing would take time. With a deep breath, I turned back to my laptop and drafted a company-wide message calling for an all-hands meeting that evening. The rumors needed to end. We needed to chart our path forward together. As I hit send, Rachel appeared in my doorway with a gentle knock. The executive team is wondering what happens next, she said, her expression sympathetic. Should I tell them to attend the all-hands, or do you want to brief them separately? Both, I decided. I'll meet them briefly before the all-hands. They deserve some context before we address everyone. She nodded. I'll arrange it. And Claire, for what it's worth, everyone I've spoken with is relieved you're staying. Her words bolstered my resolve as I prepared for what would be one of the most important presentations of my career. At 7 o'clock that evening, I stood before all Lumina employees in our largest studio space, transformed into a town hall venue. The room was packed. Instructors, administrative staff, and center managers had gathered from all locations, either in person or via video conference. The tension was palpable. Anxious whispers filled the room as people speculated about the day's dramatic events. I took a deep breath and stepped to the center of the room. By now, most of you have heard that Richard and Natalie are no longer with Lumina. What you may not know is why. I paused, considering how much to share. There were serious governance issues discovered involving unauthorized negotiations with competitors and implementation of strategic changes without proper approval. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I raised a hand to quiet them. I won't go into all the details. Some matters remain confidential for legal reasons. But I want to be clear about a few things. Lumina is not being sold. Our methodology is not being commercialized or diluted. And our mission remains unchanged, to provide authentic, evidence-based wellness practices that transform lives. Relief visibly washed over the faces of our veteran instructors. Teresa, standing in the front row, gave me an encouraging nod. The board has unanimously affirmed my continuing leadership as CEO and Chief Wellness Officer. We'll be restructuring our executive team and adding new independent directors to strengthen our governance. I moved from behind the podium, wanting to connect more directly with the team. I know this is unsettling. Leadership changes always are. But I see this as an opportunity to recommit to what makes Lumina special: our integrity, our authentic methodology, and our amazing community of practitioners and clients. Questions came quickly after that. Practical concerns about ongoing programs, reporting structures, and immediate priorities. I answered each one directly, sharing as much as I could while respecting confidentiality requirements. When asked about the modernization initiatives Natalie had been championing, I was diplomatic but clear. We'll be reviewing all recent program changes to ensure they align with our evidence-based approach and core values. Some may continue with modifications, others may be rolled back. We'll make those decisions methodically, with input from our senior instructors. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours as I answered questions, addressed concerns, and outlined our path forward. By the end, much of the initial anxiety had transformed into cautious optimism. The transparency seemed to help. Many later told me it was the first time they'd felt fully informed about the company's direction in months. As people gradually filtered out, Teresa approached me, waiting until we had a moment of privacy. "You did it," she said simply, her eyes reflecting both relief and admiration. "You saved Lumina." "We did it," I corrected her, squeezing her arm gratefully. "I couldn't have fought this battle without allies like you standing up for our methodology. Your feedback about Natalie's interference with the instructors was crucial evidence." She smiled, the tension she'd been carrying for months visibly easing from her shoulders. "What happens next?" "A lot of rebuilding," I admitted, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion after the adrenaline of the past few days. "Starting with finding a new COO and marketing director who respect what we've built here." "And personally?" she asked cautiously, the question gentle but direct. I paused, realizing I hadn't given much thought to the personal implications. My marriage was over. That much was certain. But beyond that immediate reality, I hadn't processed what came next. "One step at a time," I said finally, offering a tired smile. "Tonight I'm going home for the first time in 3 days. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding Lumina. The rest will come when it comes." She nodded understanding, gave me a quick hug, and left me to gather my things. The drive home felt surreal, as though I were returning to a place I knew intimately yet had somehow become a stranger to. Streetlights cast intermittent shadows across the dashboard as I navigated the familiar route on autopilot, my mind still processing the day's events. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I sat for a moment, staring at the craftsman house that had once represented our shared future. Now, it stood as a monument to everything that had changed. Inside, the house felt different, emptier somehow, though not just physically. Richard had already removed many of his personal items, likely during my hotel stay. His attorney had arranged for him to collect the remaining things while I was at work over the coming days. I wandered through each room slowly, reclaiming the space emotionally. The living room where we'd hosted dinner parties for potential investors. The kitchen where we'd celebrated our first major funding round with champagne and takeout. The office, where we'd spent countless evenings strategizing Lumina's growth. Each space held memories of our shared journey, both professional and personal. In my home office, I found Richard had left behind the framed photo from Lumina's first location opening. We stood together, champagne glasses raised, his arm around my waist, both of us beaming with pride and possibility. I studied our faces, searching for signs of the betrayal to come. Had it always been inevitable? Had I missed early warnings? Or had something fundamental changed along the way? With a sigh, I placed the photo in a drawer. Those questions had no useful answers now. The past couldn't be rewritten, only the future remained malleable. The silence of the house was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text from Maya. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected," I replied honestly. "Tired but clear-headed." "You should be proud," she texted back. Not everyone could have handled this with such grace and strategic thinking. Pride wasn't what I felt, more like grim satisfaction mixed with lingering sadness. I had protected what mattered to me, but at significant personal cost. I set the phone down without responding further and poured myself a glass of wine, absorbing the strange new reality of my life. The initial shock and drama of Richard and Natalie's departure gradually gave way to the methodical work of rebuilding. The weeks that followed were intense but purposeful, each day bringing new challenges that required attention and strategic thinking. With the board's full support, we conducted a thorough audit of all changes implemented during Richard and Natalie's campaign. The process was painstaking but necessary, reviewing each modification, assessing its impact, and making careful decisions about whether to reverse or retain it. We kept those innovations that genuinely improved the client experience while rolling back changes that had compromised our methodology's integrity. The leadership restructuring was equally methodical. Rather than rushing to fill vacancies, I worked with the board to clearly define what Lumina needed in its executive team moving forward. We created more robust job descriptions, implemented stronger reporting structures, and established clear boundaries between roles to prevent the kind of power concentration that had enabled Richard's scheme. After careful consideration, I hired a respected wellness industry veteran as our new COO, someone with both corporate experience and a genuine commitment to authentic practices. The marketing director role went to an internal promotion, a team member who had consistently championed our core values while bringing fresh ideas to our outreach efforts. Throughout this transition, I made a point of being highly visible to our team members, regularly visiting locations, teaching occasional classes myself, and hosting open forums for instructors to voice concerns and suggestions. This transparent approach helped rebuild the trust that had been damaged during Richard's secretive maneuvers. Within a month, we had expanded the board with 2 independent directors, a former yoga studio chain founder who understood our industry from the inside, and a corporate ethics professor who specialized in governance for mission-driven companies. Their fresh perspectives and relevant expertise immediately strengthened our decision-making processes. The results began to show. Our instructor retention, which had been quietly declining, stabilized and then improved as word spread that Lumina was recommitting to its authentic roots. Client numbers, which had begun to drop at the modernized locations, rebounded once we restored our original approach. The financial metrics gradually improved as well, validating our decision to remain true to our founding principles. 6 weeks after Richard's departure, as I was reviewing our quarterly performance projections with our new financial team, my email notification chimed. The sender's name immediately caught my attention: Jason Miller, Velocity's CEO. With a mixture of curiosity and wariness, I opened the message. "Claire, I'd like to meet to discuss potential partnership opportunities between our companies. No acquisition agenda this time. I think we both know that ship has sailed. But I remain impressed with the Lumina methodology and believe there could be mutual benefit in a more limited collaboration." I showed the email to Gregory during our weekly update call that afternoon. "Your licensing partnership idea might have legs after all," he remarked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded. "I'll meet with him, from a position of strength this time." The meeting with Jason Miller proved surprisingly productive. Free from Richard's manipulations, we were able to have an honest conversation about where our company's interests might align without compromising our respective identities. Miller was far more reasonable than Richard had portrayed him. A shrewd businessman, certainly, but one who recognized the value in authentic partnerships rather than hostile takeovers. After several weeks of careful negotiation and due diligence, we structured a licensing agreement allowing Velocity to offer a streamlined version of our methodology in their fitness centers, branded as Lumina Elements, and clearly differentiated from our comprehensive approach. The deal generated substantial licensing revenue without compromising our independence or core offerings. The partnership made business sense for both companies. Velocity gained access to our evidence-based methodology to enhance their primarily fitness-focused offerings, while we expanded our reach to clientele who might eventually seek the deeper experience of our full Lumina centers. More importantly, it demonstrated that growth and authenticity weren't mutually exclusive, the very principle Richard had failed to understand. 3 months after the failed coup, Lumina was unquestionably stronger than before. Our methodology protected, our leadership aligned with our values, our financial position enhanced by strategic partnerships. What Richard had tried to dismantle had instead been reinforced. The painful episode had exposed weaknesses in our structure that, once addressed, made the company more resilient. On a rare, quiet Sunday in early autumn, I sat in my garden watching golden afternoon light filter through the Japanese maple I'd planted when we first bought the house. The leaves were beginning to turn, their edges tinged with red. A season of change, both in nature and in my life. The divorce proceedings were well underway. Straightforward in terms of asset division, but emotionally draining nonetheless. Richard had relocated to Chicago, reportedly working for a private equity firm that specialized in wellness industry acquisitions. The irony wasn't lost on me. Natalie had disappeared from the wellness industry entirely, her LinkedIn profile now listing a marketing position with a tech company in Seattle. Maya joined me in the garden, bringing 2 glasses of iced tea and settling into the adjacent chair. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the peaceful afternoon. "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said finally. "What's that?" she asked. "How close they came to succeeding." I turned to look at her. If I hadn't protected the IP through that licensing structure years ago, if I hadn't noticed the warning signs and started gathering evidence, if you hadn't helped me prepare. Maya nodded thoughtfully. "It's scary how vulnerable we all are to betrayal from those we trust most. But also how powerful foresight can be," I added. "That licensing agreement wasn't created because I expected my husband to betray me. It was standard business protection that became a lifeline when I needed it most." The lesson being, I smiled slightly, build your life and business with trust, but incorporate safeguards for when trust fails. Not out of paranoia, but prudence. Maya raised her glass in a toast. To prudence, then, and to sisters who have each other's backs. I clinked my glass against hers. And to fine print. Never underestimate the power of fine print. We laughed together in the warm afternoon sun, the garden blooming around us, a fitting metaphor for my own renewal. What Richard and Natalie had intended as my end had become instead a new beginning. They had tried to push me out of my own company, but in doing so, had only reaffirmed why it was mine to begin with. The business I had built with heart and vision remained intact, protected by the foresight they had dismissed and the strength they had underestimated. In the end, that was the most appropriate consequence of all. 6 months after Richard and Natalie's departure, I found myself speaking at the annual Wellness Industry Leadership Summit in Sedona. The organizers had asked me to address maintaining authenticity during growth, a topic that now felt almost prophetic given what we'd experienced at Lumina. Standing before a room of industry peers, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the crisis we'd weathered, not for the betrayal itself, but for the clarity it had brought. The greatest threat to wellness companies today isn't competition or market forces, I told the audience. It's the gradual erosion of purpose in pursuit of scale. When we start believing that authenticity and growth are opposing forces, we've already begun to lose what makes us valuable. The lesson had been painful, but profound. What Richard had dismissed as my stubborn attachment to outdated principles had actually been Lumina's greatest strength, the authentic methodology that clients trusted and practitioners believed in. Later, that evening, sitting on the terrace of my hotel room watching the famous red rocks fade into silhouettes against the darkening sky, I reflected on how much had changed within me. The betrayal had stripped away certain illusions about my marriage, about business relationships, about trust itself. But rather than leaving cynicism in their place, the experience had refined my understanding of what truly mattered. I no longer saw business safeguards as pessimistic precautions, but as essential foundations that protected what was valuable. I recognized that leadership wasn't about controlling everything, but about creating systems strong enough to withstand human failings, including my own. The divorce had finalized the previous month with surprising civility. Neither Richard nor I had the emotional energy for a protracted legal battle. We divided assets according to our prenuptial agreement, and our lives diverged cleanly, like two roads that had run parallel before curving in opposite directions. In me, quiet moments. I sometimes still wondered what had changed him, or if he had always been capable of such calculated betrayal, and I simply hadn't seen it. Perhaps power and ambition had merely amplified existing traits, revealing his true character, under pressure. Whatever the truth, I had stopped looking for meaning in his actions and instead found it in my response. The crisis had revealed strengths I hadn't fully recognized in myself: resilience, strategic thinking, and the ability to fight for what mattered without surrendering my principles. The greatest revelation, however, was learning the difference between isolation and independence. I had built Lumina largely through my own vision, often feeling that ultimate responsibility rested solely on my shoulders. The crisis had taught me the value of true allies, not just employees or investors, but people who shared my values and were willing to stand for them when it mattered most. My sister Maya, Teresa, Rachel, and others had formed a foundation of support that proved stronger than Richard's machinations. Their loyalty wasn't born from obligation or advantage, but from shared belief in what Lumina represented. This was perhaps the most meaningful lesson. Authentic strength comes not from self-sufficiency, but from genuine connection to something larger than oneself, a purpose, a community, a set of values worth defending. 1 year after the attempted coup, Lumina hosted a retreat for all staff at a lakeside conference center outside Portland. The company had not only recovered but thrived, expanding to 18 locations, launching an acclaimed instructor certification program, and establishing partnerships that extended our methodology's reach without compromising its integrity. Standing. Before the assembled team, now over 200 strong, I felt a surge of pride not just in what we had built, but in how we had rebuilt it. A year ago, we faced a fundamental choice about Lumina's future, I began. Not just about who would lead the company, but about what kind of company we wanted to be. Today, I look around this room and see the answer. Our journey forward hadn't been without challenges. Some days still brought difficult decisions about growth opportunities, strategic partnerships, or program evolution. But these discussions now took place within a framework of shared values and transparent governance, preventing any single voice, including mine, from dominating without accountability. The new board structure had proved particularly valuable, bringing diverse perspectives while maintaining alignment with our core mission. The independent directors had challenged us to think more creatively about scaling authenticity, finding innovative ways to grow without dilution. The Velocity partnership, somewhat surprisingly, had evolved into a model collaboration. What began as a limited licensing arrangement had expanded to include joint research projects studying the measurable health impacts of our methodology. The data had attracted interest from healthcare systems and corporate wellness programs, opening entirely new markets. Most significantly, I had gradually shifted my own role, focusing more on methodology development and strategic vision while empowering our expanded leadership team to drive day-to-day operations. This transition had been both professional and personal, learning to lead through influence rather than control, to trust others with what I had built. The divorce, while painful, had ultimately been liberating. Without the complications of a failing marriage interwoven with business leadership, I found new clarity and energy. My home, now redecorated and rearranged to reflect my own tastes, had become a sanctuary rather than a memorial to what was lost. As for Richard, our paths rarely crossed. Industry gossip occasionally brought news. He had launched a venture fund focused on wellness acquisitions, with varying success. Natalie had apparently moved on to a third company in as many years. Their stories were no longer entwined with mine. Looking out at the lake as the retreat's evening reception wound down, I found myself in conversation with Mira, who had evolved from skeptical investor to valued advisor. "If you could go back?" she asked, swirling her wine thoughtfully. "Would you have done anything differently? Before the crisis, I mean." I considered the question carefully. I would have built stronger governance systems earlier, not because I anticipated betrayal, but because great structures support great work regardless of who's involved. She nodded. "And personally?" "I would have trusted my instincts sooner," I admitted. There were warning signs I minimized or explained away. But ultimately, I paused, searching for the right words. I wouldn't change what happened. Some lessons can only be learned through fire. As the sun set over the water, casting golden light across the gathering of people who had helped rebuild Lumina, I felt a sense of completion. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything had instead forged something stronger. A company more resilient, leadership more distributed, and a founder who understood that the ultimate measure of success wasn't control, but creation, that outlasted any individual. The fine print had saved Lumina, but it was the larger vision, the commitment to authentic, transformative wellness, that had made it worth saving. And that would carry us forward, whatever challenges the future might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.